Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. Today we're going to be exploring and looking for skinwalkers and wendigos. As always, these stories were sent in by viewers just like you. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. Stories like yours help keep this show going. Now, without any further ado, sit back, relax, and be sure to lock all your doors and windows, because we're gonna go hunt some wendigos. So I'm 14 years old, and I'm originally from Northern Ireland, but for most of my life, up until recently, I've lived in Utah in the United States. Me and my family lived on a horse ranch owned by my dad in the more rural part of the town where we were from. Now, I myself have never really believed in Native American legends such as skinwalkers or wendigos. That was until around 2 months ago, I would say. I would normally have trouble getting to sleep, and so would stay up until around 4 a.m. watching YouTube or Netflix, or sometimes even playing my PS4. This particular night, I was playing Call of Duty online with my friends, and everything was completely normal up until about 1:30 a.m., when I start to hear scratching and odd noises coming from outside. Note that I was wearing a gaming headset with gunshots and voices blasting through, and could hear them throughout this noise. So, being the overly curious girl I am, I took off the headphones and got up to go check out the window. I saw nothing at first. On my way back to my chair, however, I heard something that nearly made me crap myself. It called me. It called me by name. In my youngest sister's voice, too. It sounded panicked and scared, and it fooled me. My protective sister instincts kicked in and bolted downstairs, not even bothering to check if my sisters were in their room or not. Now, you must know that I am a cautious person, even though I was stupid enough not to check my sister's room, and so I grabbed my dad's old baseball bat before unlocking the back door. I opened the door after switching on the back porch light and stepped outside. I called my sister's name. "Beth? Beth, are you okay?" No response was given. "Beth, where are you? If this is another joke, I'm not finding it very amusing." Still nothing. Fear began crawling up my spine, and I began to become fidgety, rubbing my spare hand up and down my other arm. Then I heard it again. My sister's voice. Only it wasn't. It sounded off, detached even. It sounded like her, but at the same time it didn't. It said it another few times, each time getting louder and more urgent. The voice sounded as though she were in pain. "Beth, are you all right? You're beginning to scare me now. Where are you?" I said, starting to edge toward the end of the patio and closer to the grass. The bat was now held tighter in my hands. There was something out there with me, and it wasn't my sister. Before I reached the very edge of the patio, I heard shuffling coming from the trees at the very end of our garden. The trees lead into a wooded area at the back of our house, and my parents have warned us that we're not really supposed to enter it unless they're with us. So I was hesitant to go any further. That's when I noticed it. A pair of glowing yellow eyes glaring through the bushes. My skin became cold, and the air began to smell foul, like burnt flesh. I was paralyzed with fear. The eyes began to rise as whatever it was stood up, but it was surpassing 8 feet at least by this point. This wasn't an animal. At least, nothing natural. I knew this in my gut. Every cell in the body was telling me to turn and run, but I just couldn't do it. It felt as though its eyes were holding me in place, like there was an invisible bind around me, keeping me from running to safety. I had a feeling that if I did decide to leg it, that this thing would catch me in a matter of steps. It took a step forward, then another, and another, until it was in my sight. It was horrible. Its head was that of a buck with antlers, and all of its body was proportioned oddly. Fur was missing in places, revealing flesh and bone. Ribs were visible, and its limbs were twisted in strange and contorted ways. But what weirded me out the most was not its head, or limbs, or body. Not even the unusually sharp teeth and glowing eyes. But the fact that it was standing up on its hind legs, and seemingly having no bother doing so. The way it walked was almost human. In fact, it seemed to be all too comfortable walking this way. Then I heard my name being called again, but this time, it was from behind me. My sister, my real sister. She sounded so confused and utterly terrified upon noticing the creature. Her voice is what knocked me out of the trance-like state. Bat still in hand, I turned and ran. Surprisingly, I managed to reach the house and my sister shut the door, locking it, all before the thing managed to get me. I grabbed my sister's hand and dragged her down and under the kitchen table with me. As I held my sister close in my arms, I could tell she was shaking, wet tears sliding down her face. "What was that?" she asked in a quiet voice. I simply shook my head as if to tell her that I had no idea. Suddenly, we heard banging on the door. Only one word went through my head. Crap. I got up with my sister and looked to the door and immediately regretted it. There, hunched over, large and misshapen, hands pressed to the glass, was the creature. I felt like passing out. Lifting my sister up onto my back, I bolted for the stairs into my sister's room, slamming the door shut behind me. The banging resumed, only this time more viciously. I heard my parents getting out of bed and opening their bedroom door. I swung open the door that I was behind and immediately stopped them from rushing downstairs. "Don't go down there, please!" I begged them before proceeding to drag them into the room with my two sisters, where I told them everything. My parents obviously didn't believe a word of it. That was until my sister recounted to them that she saw the same thing after noticing how shaken up I was. They seemingly took our word for it. My dad got his phone from his room and called a friend, who happened to be of Navajo descent. I described the creature which was currently lurking in our backyard. There was a pause on the other side of the line before he finally spoke, saying, "Stay where you are, blockade the door, and get under the beds. Make sure the window is locked and the curtains are drawn. They are able to climb." That fact sent a chill down my spine. "What is it that's out there?" I asked in a monotone voice. My people refused to speak their name. It is said, speaking of them will draw attention to yourselves or making the current situation 10 times worse. I will be over as soon as I can. And with that, he hung up. Approximately 20 minutes later, we heard a vehicle come to a stop right outside of our house, and a number of voices began shouting in Navajo. From the little I understood of the language, it was things like, "Leave, you are not wanted here," or "These people are innocent, get away from them." Names like demon or evil spirit. The chanting was chilling. But what scared me the most was the gunshots and shrill screams coming from the beast. Soon the gunshots stopped along with the screaming and chanting. A chorus of heavy footsteps was heard coming up the stairs, and we heard my dad's friend announce that the creature has fled. I was unsure about this, as it could still be the creature playing tricks, but before I could do anything, my father was on his feet and pushing the dresser away from the door and opening it. There stood our rescuers, clad in these weird robes and strange jewelry. I got up and ran to them and gave them the biggest hug I could muster. I'm not a very cuddly person. Before they left, they handed my dad packets of silver bullets and gave us strict instructions that should the beast return, we coat the bullets with ash and shoot them at it. There would, however, be no need for it to return, as a week later, we were moving our asses back to Northern Ireland. That was only after, Of course, thanking our Navajo friends for probably saving our lives. From what I gathered in my research, the creature was likely a Skinwalker. I hope and pray that I never have another encounter with that creature or anything like it in the future. Two to 3 years ago, my immediate family, my mom, my dad, my brother, and myself, went on a vacation to see the Badlands in South Dakota. It was beautiful during the day, brutally hot but an amazing view. My family has always been interested in the wildlife of the areas we traveled to, so we would take bison tours and would drive around to see any random wildlife, and we saw some cool animals like a prairie owl, pronghorn, antelopes, and some huge bison. At one point in the trip, we took a tour bus to a picnic which 70 people were at. It was about 6 a.m., and I was kinda bored, so I wandered away from the crowd a little bit to look at a small stable near the edge of a small set of woods. I was wandering around and petting the horses when I felt like I was being watched. I looked in the woods and saw nothing at first. I brushed it off as maybe just some small animal that I didn't see. But the feeling never left, so I went back to the group to feel safer, and I sat down at a table next to my dad, and I looked back in the thin birch woods and saw something looking at me. It was very pale and tall, with very bony joints and beady eyes. It looked to be at least 6'9". It looked like it was trying to be human, but didn't exactly know how to be. Once it caught me looking back, it dashed back into the woods, disappearing. I was a little scared but more interested. What was that thing I just saw? I brushed it off and continued to have fun. We left about an hour later, at 7:30. We went back to the cabins. For some context, we were staying in a small cabin set in the middle of nowhere. The barn area was about a half an hour drive away, and all the big city areas like Rapid City were an hour to 2 hours away. Nobody in my family was tired yet, so we went to see a ranger talk, where it was all about the stars and how to identify constellations. It was actually really fun. So as the ranger was talking, a bunch of weird howling noises started up, and everyone looked at the ranger, who seemed to not be bothered at all. He was just calmly saying that it was coyotes and they wouldn't bother us. But right after he said that, a howl came up. It sounded like it was a crackhead, but much deeper and more nasally. The ranger seemed a little more confused and laughed off, saying it was probably nothing. But the rest of the presentation, he seemed on edge. After the talk, we headed back to the cabins to start settling down. I was tired, so I changed into my pajamas and went to bed, but I didn't stay asleep for very long. I had woken up at around 3 a.m. and laughed to myself since it was the witching hour. After trying to fall back asleep for about an hour to no avail, I got up and put on a Shark Week show on TV. I was semi-listening to it while zoning off and looking out the window. There was a floodlight coming off and on our house. I could see very clearly. A pronghorn was grazing on some very thin patches of grass about 10 yards away. But it was strange that he was alone out there, since I always saw them in herds. After watching him for about 5 minutes or so, his ears seemingly perked up and looked at me. I jokingly smiled and waved to it, and sweet Christ above, the thing smiled back at me. I wish I was joking and could say I hallucinated it, but I was wide awake. Its teeth looked abnormally human, and so did its eyes. It eventually walked away, but its hooves looked more like feet. I can say by now, I was shaking. I got up and went back to my room. When morning came around, I woke up and threw on my shoes and ran outside to where that animal was to make sure that there were no hoof tracks. I looked everywhere I could, and there were no hoof tracks. But you know what there were? There were what looked like half hoof, half human hand tracks. I freaked out and woke up my mom and dad to show them. They were so confused by it. So we found the Star Guide Park Ranger and asked him about the footprints. He asked to see them, and we took him over to them. He took a nice long look at them and said, "Well, I'll be damned. I thought the other rangers were crazy when they told me they saw a Skinwalker. Turns out they're right." Apparently this has been going on for a while, and is known amongst other rangers. So we all went to the museum and talked to one of the Native American female rangers who calls him Yi Nadlushi, a Navajo term for Skinwalker, and she explained the history of Skinwalkers, which is a type of harmful witch who has the ability to turn into, possess, or even disguise themselves as an animal. She said she's seen this guy a few times, and we should be on edge anytime we see something strange like that. I am a truck driver based in Montana, and I experienced something out of the ordinary today. I'm on a dedicated route, making one trip daily between Lewistown and Glendive. The same old route, highway, and scenery. Needless to say, I'm as acquainted with this road as I am the palm of my own hand. Today, on the return trip after my delivery, on Montana State Highway 200 in the westbound lane between mile marker 193 and 194, lay a discarded carcass of a medium-sized dog. Only the animal was completely skinned from nose to tail. Not a trace of fur or any other identifying features visible anywhere, and no blood on the pavement surrounding it. It was positioned squarely on the side of the driving lane lengthwise, and I had to maneuver my rig to the left to avoid running it over. This may not be the scariest story, but the context surrounding it is very bizarre. This happens to be one of the most isolated rural parts of the state. There was no town or visible signs of civilization as far as the eye could see in any direction, and I was at least 60 miles from the nearest community. The dog's carcass was too intact to have fallen from a moving vehicle or have been run over, leading me to speculate it was dropped off there on purpose by someone or something. It honestly made me think of those folklore stories involving satanic rituals with animal sacrifices or something akin to the events of the infamous Skinwalker Ranch in Utah with alleged UFO abductions and stuff like that. I've lived in this state my whole life and have only been driving a truck for about 2 years now, but have seen a lot of roadkill and other gory scenes on our highways all throughout my life. This incident really struck off the wall and, honest to Pete, made my skin crawl because of how unusual it was. I'm not easily spooked or riled by anything, but this had me putting the hammer down and getting back home faster than any day previously. I'll be making the same trip tomorrow morning, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm a bit anxious about what may or may not be there in the same spot when I drive by again. I'm not exactly sure if this would count as an encounter with a Skinwalker, but from all the stories I've heard in this area and from my own little sighting there, I think a Skinwalker may be roaming the area and potentially hunting people's pets or something. What do you guys think? I was 14 when this all happened. I was camping in Northern California, Mendocino County to be exact. I ended my night normally, putting out the campfire with a water bottle after taking a bike ride around the campgrounds. It was a fair distance campsite in the redwoods, maybe less than a quarter mile between each of its sites. I got ready for bed, not really bothering to change because I only packed so many articles of clothing. I did the normal. I checked on my games I downloaded before coming up there because there was no reception, turned on my Spotify with this new band I downloaded that I really liked, and off away to sleep world I was. I wake up at about 2 a.m. I don't recall very clearly as this was 2 years ago. I'm not sure what woke me up or why. I assumed it was a loud truck going by on the highway, as we had one of those near the campground. I thought in my head it was probably a cop driving by as there were sirens from fire trucks and other vehicles once every couple of times a day. I attempted to sail back to sleep until I started hearing a bag ripping noise as the trash bags and boxes were about 25 feet away from me. Granted, this scared me a lot. I sat up for about 5 minutes and thought, what could this thing be? I came to the conclusion it was a raccoon. The digging oddly stopped after I made that assumption though. I started feeling sick to my stomach out of nowhere. Not sure why, but I attempted to go back to sleep. Suddenly I began hearing breathing. Not human breathing, and not small animal breathing. I mean large breathing from something on the other side of this log behind my tent. I am now awake, in full flight or fight mode, too scared to speak or make a noise. The breathing stops and I am still pumped full of adrenaline. At this point, we tried to put the fire out at about 1 a.m. and failed to do so, so we left a little of what was left to burn. Suddenly, I began hearing footsteps. Very, very heavy footsteps. At this point, I have literally never related to the term scared to death in my life before. However, I was in for a treat. The footsteps continue for about 30 seconds. Here I am, paralyzed, sitting up in my bed. I attempt to ever so quietly pull my phone out and text 911, as I am too scared to call because of this thing is literally walking about 2 feet away from my tent. I have a very descriptive text as to what is happening, where I was at, and how to locate me exactly. I believed at this time it was a person, maybe just an incredibly obese pedophile. All text messages fail to go through. I sit there for 20 minutes trying to send this text through, and then I start crying. I'm trying to hold back my tears and not make a noise, as I'm thinking about how I'm going to get brutally murdered in the middle of nowhere. Finally, a text message goes through. I get a response saying text is not currently a viable way to contact 911. What? I thought in my head. Why would this be a response at all? At last, the footsteps stopped. I can finally start hearing my heartbeat again instead of being completely numb. I give it a couple of minutes before I try to yell for a family member, and you can call me scared or whatever it might be, but if this has ever happened to you in your life, you may just reconsider that. Suddenly, I hear a scream, not very far out. I am now about to actually throw up from fear and begin whispering for my dad, and I get no response. At this point, I'm crying and yelling for him. They wake up and come out to my tent and ask what happened. It wasn't normal for my parents or anyone who knows me as a person to cry and break down, but this was a very different occasion. I had to have my father sleep on the ground with me until about 6 a.m. due to pure fear. Keep in mind, by the time this walking stopped, it was at least around 3:55 a.m. Almost 2 hours passed in a matter of no time. It felt short, but it felt long at the same time. He woke me up in the morning to invite me to start a fire with him to get my mind off of it. Keep in mind, I did not sleep at all, maybe about 20 minutes of shut-eye in total. At this point, I am about to cry again because of how traumatic that was. I'm not sure what this thing was, if this was a person or what, but to this day I'm convinced it was a skinwalker or some kind of creature. Keep in mind, this thing was walking on 2 feet like an ape or a person, as I never heard, as far as I can remember, 4 legs. Only 2. This hasn't stopped me from camping as I continue to do it every year, but, honestly, this creeped me out and I just really wanted to share it. This story was told to me by my brother, so whether you believe it or not is up to you, but I sure as hell believe this. It occurred during the early 2000s. Smartphones had not been invented yet, only crappy flip phones with sketchy cellular service. My brother was an electrician, a journeyman if you will. He was employed in a small border town called Gallup, New Mexico. Gallup is situated on the cusp of the Navajo Nation reservation, in the area called the Checkerboard area, due to the fact that there are designated plots of land that are considered a part of the res, and the next part of the land is not, like a checkerboard. There is a large population of multiple tribes in the area such as the Navajo, Pueblo, Zuni, etc. One night, my brother and one of his co-workers, who was a Chinese American, were the only 2 employees on call, in case of emergencies. A power line goes down or something catastrophic happens, something in the realm of, that. Usually, these incidents will happen out in the middle of nowhere, outside of Gallup towards the Continental Divide. He receives a call early in the morning, sometime after 1 a.m. The co-worker had recently become the father of a newborn, but desperately needed the hours. My brother calls him and they agree to meet up at the company stockyard. My brother waits about an hour or so, and his co-worker still hasn't shown up. It is strict company protocol to never go on jobs alone, always in pairs or more, due to the hazardous nature of high voltage lines and electricity in general. My brother's co-worker calls and tells him that something is wrong with the newborn and he needs to take his wife to the ER and he'll meet up with him on site, also another injunction. They are strictly instructed to show up onto the job site in the company vehicles, which are equipped with tools required for the job and all that. My brother understands and doesn't want his coworker to be docked pay or written up for violating company policy. Against his better judgment, he heads out alone. The job site is quite literally in the middle of nowhere. The power line spanning across the vast desert with red rock mesa in the far distance. In the daylight at least. At nighttime it is pitch black New Mexican desert. Only dirt roads and no houses or streetlights for miles. None could be seen along the entire horizon. He waits as long as he cares to wait for his coworker. He figures he'll assess the damage on his own, and by the time his coworker shows up he'll have a solution. He suits up and begins crawling the tall wooden pole. The company truck is parked facing toward the pole. The high beams illuminated the base of the subsequent foreground. He reaches the top of the pole. Some time passes as he is trying to calibrate the issue or solve the problem of the power outage. Something on the ground below him catches the corner of his peripheral vision. He looks down in disbelief and shock as his mind tries to make sense of what he is seeing. He described it as a man crawling on all fours wearing the skin of a coyote. The skin draped along its back with the limbs like dead weight dangling toward the ground. He watches as the creature patrols the area. He said he witnessed the Skinwalker encircle the truck with smaller and smaller orbits, until eventually it stood up on 2 feet and peered inside the window of the truck on the driver's side. He described the motion of the Skinwalker and said it was sickly and moving as if it was confused as to what was going on or where the truck driver was. From his vantage point, he could infer that the Skinwalker was male. He could tell that it was painted with black paint and white clay. Then on the horizon he could see headlights. His co-worker was en route. The Skinwalker noticed this as well, not figuring out that he was on the power line pole. His partner approached closer and the Skinwalker runs off into the dark on all fours. The rest of the trouble call was uneventful, in regard to the Skinwalker, that is. Thanks for listening to these creepy and downright unexplainable Skinwalker and Wendigo stories. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss new videos, as I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, whether it's a Skinwalker story or something else, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp, and stories like yours that help keep this show going. If you're not aware, you can download your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and pretty much everywhere else you listen to podcasts. Thank you guys, as always, for supporting the swamp as you do. I can't thank you guys enough for always pushing us to new milestones. If you guys made it all the way to the end of this video, I have a question for you. What do you think is scarier? Being chased and attacked by a dog man, or being chased and attacked by a Skinwalker? I'd really like to know your answers in the comments down below. I'll see you guys soon. with another creepy video.